So Abraham Lincoln was born February 12th, 1809, in Hardin County, Kentucky. His parents were Thomas Lincoln, and his mother was Nancy Hanks Lincoln. Nancy Hanks came from a family, the Hanks family. It was believed that she was born out of wedlock. Her mother was Lucy Hanks, and Lucy Hanks ended up marrying a man by the name of Henry Sparrow, and he pretty much adopted Nancy Hanks. Nancy Hanks was hired out to a couple and worked as basically a maid for a while, and then she ended up moving in and living with her uncle Richard Hanks. You'll hear more about the sparrows in the future video. But Nancy Hanks grew up in Kentucky also, and she married Thomas Lincoln, and they had their son born in 1809. Now, Abe's sister Sarah Lincoln was born February the 10th of 1807. So Sarah Lincoln, his older sister, was almost 2 years older than him, and they grew up together until Sarah reached adulthood, and I'll go into that more detail. Thomas Lincoln's father was named Abraham Lincoln also, and he was killed earlier before Abe was born. I'll go into more detail about that in the future. But Abe was born on February 12th, I'm sorry, of 1809, and in Hardin County, Kentucky. Well, was given while he was running in politics to become president. He was told that they wanted him to do a biography on himself, an autobiography on himself. So there's a little bit of a snippet of what he said about himself uh, growing up in life, and basically he said in um, in his introduction, his autobiography, he said, "I was born February 12th, 1809, in Hardin County, Kentucky. My parents were both from Virginia, of undistinguished families, second families perhaps, I should say. My mother, who died in my 10th year, was of a family of the name of Hanks, some of whom now reside in Adams and others in Macon County, Illinois." So that's what he did as an introduction to his autobiography when he was asked to do one for uh, politics before he became president. Now, Abe had an older cousin by the name of Dennis Hanks, a little bit older than him, and you'll hear more about Dennis Hanks in this series in the future. But Dennis Hanks was there when Abe was born, and Dennis Hanks was known to have said later on in life, or wrote, "Mother got flustered and hurried up her work to go over to look after the little fella. But I didn't have nothing to do, so I cut around the hill 2 miles to see my new cousin. Nancy was there in the pole bed looking pretty happy. Tom built up a good fire and throwed a bear skin over the covers to keep them warm. Mother came over and washed him and put a yellow flannel petticoat and a linsey shirt on him, and cooked some dried berries with wild honey for Nancy, and slicked things up and went home, and that's all much of them got." So those are basically the words of Dennis Hanks, his cousin. Later on, Abe would also say in his autobiography, "My paternal grandfather, Abraham Lincoln, emigrated from Rockingham County, Virginia, to Kentucky about 1781 or two, and a year or two later he was killed by Indians, not in battle, but by stealth when he was laboring to open a farm in the forest." His ancestors, who were Quakers, went to Virginia from Berks County, Pennsylvania. My father, at the time of the death of his father, was but 6 years of age. So Thomas Lincoln was 6 years old when Abe's grandfather died in the field. Now, Abe had a younger brother by the name of Thomas Lincoln that was born in 1812. I think probably around November. There's little information on him, and he died as an infant, so they had to bury him on the homestead there, next to the cabin where Abe and Sarah grew up. Dennis Hanks would write that his cousin, Abe Lincoln, it didn't seem no time till Abe was running around in buckskin moccasins and breeches, a tow linen shirt, and a coonskin cap. That's the way we all dressed then. We couldn't keep sheep for the wolves, and poor folks didn't have any flex except what they could get trading skins. Abe never gave Nancy no trouble after he could walk, except to keep him in clothes. Most of the time we went barefoot, even wear wet buckskin gloves. I'm sorry, even wear a wet buckskin glove. These moccasins wasn't no protective against the wet. That's Dennis Hanks later on said of Lincoln's childhood. Abe was right out in the middle woods as soon as he was weaned, fishing in the creek, setting traps for rabbits and muskrats, and going on coon hunts with with Tom and the dogs, and dropping corn for his pappy, and following up bees to find bees trees. When six, Abe and Sarah were sent to a dirt floored school right up the road to learn. Mostly it was blah school. Now, getting back to Abe's autobiography, he said, "We removed from Kentucky to what is now Spencer County, Indiana. In my 8th year, we reached our new home about the time the state entered the Union. It was a wild region with many bears and other wild animals still in the woods. The panthers filled the night with fear, and bears preyed on the swine. A lonesome country, settlers few, about one being to each square mile, families 2 and 3 miles apart." Now, there's questions as why Thomas had moved to Indiana. Abe basically thought that his idea was that there were some land problems in Kentucky, and uh, Thomas was afraid of losing the property because there were some crooked dealings going on in Kentucky over land rights. Abe also thought that Thomas had moved to Indiana to get away from the slavery issue. So Abe thinks that there is an issue with that is why he moved to Indiana also, because Indiana was a free state at the time. In any event, they did move up to Indiana when Abe was about 9 years old. He said, according to him, it was 8 years old. So Thomas Lincoln, his daughter Sarah, his wife Nancy Hanks Lincoln, and his son Abraham Lincoln, approximately 8 years old at the time, and Dennis Hanks moved to Indiana, southern Indiana, near Spencer County now. Originally, at that time, was called Perry County, which is in southern Indiana. Along with them came Elizabeth Sparrow. Elizabeth Sparrow was the sister of Nancy's mother, Lucy Sparrow. So obviously, I don't have any information on that, but I think that Elizabeth Hanks also married into the Sparrow family. But in any event, she went with them into southern Indiana and established a whole household there. In the summer of 1818, there was a sickness going through the area known as milk sickness, they called it back in those days. And it was a scourge of that area at the time. And it made the settlers sick, and they actually died from this sickness. Now, what later on in the 30s, there was a scientist that did research and found out what was causing this sickness was actually caused by the cows that would eat uh, snakewood. It's a weed, snakewood, and that would the snakewood had poison in it, which would go into the milk of the cows. Now, it didn't affect the cows, but it did affect the milk. So the settlers were drinking this milk and getting poisoned by this snakeweed. This happened in the summer of 1818. And the reason why it did happen is because snakeweed, they found out, grows in forested areas. It cannot stand sunlight. So when they had moved to this area, which was wooded, foresty, and the snakeweed would grow and the cows would eat it. Following that, the summers after that, they started tearing down these woods, these forests, and plowing under the uh, weeds. So the weeds did not grow in the sun. They only grew in the shadow, shade. Excuse me. So what happened is it just disappeared, and the settlers did not know what caused it until the 30s, where the scientists found out what caused that. Now, Nancy Hanks got sick from this milk sickness, and Elizabeth Sparrow was taking care of her during that summer, September, and she died. Well, Elizabeth Sparrow also was drinking milk. She got sick and she died too. So many of the settlers in that area were dying from milk sickness and they didn't know why. And then, like I said before, it all of a sudden disappeared and nobody knew anything about it. And according to Abe's autobiography, he was 8 years old when this happened. So he had no he was about 8 or 9, not I think about 8, 9, 10, but he had lost his mother when he was 8 years old when they were in Indiana. So Nancy Hanks passed away on October 5th, 1818. Now these were the last words that Abe and his sister Sarah heard before Nancy Hanks, his mother, passed away.
Be good to your father, to one another, and to the world.
Now, in 1816, when Thomas Lincoln moved with his family up to Indiana, this was the same year that Indiana became a state. And so this is what Abraham Lincoln said in his autobiography, that they moved up to Indiana, southern Indiana, around the year that Indiana became a state. Now, in that same year, in 1816, there was a volcanic eruption on the far side of the earth, on the other side of the earth, and it was Mount Tambora in Indonesia, uh, caused a worldwide climate change. The smoke and dust from this volcano had actually blanked out a lot of the sunlight, which caused a global epidemic of snow and crops that failed and all of that. And this is known as the Great Freeze of 1816. The effects of that were still lingering up until 1819, shortly after they moved up to Indiana and shortly after Abe lost his mother. So Abe can recall years where he had to walk, months where he had to walk in the deep snow to get anywhere. And they were saying uh, creeks would freeze over in 10 minutes. There'd be such a drop in temperature that people could freeze. The clothes would freeze on them before they even got to the well to get water. So it was so brutally cold. And Abe recalled that many years later, how he had to walk through the snow. The winter of 1818 was very harsh because of the volcano of 1816. Lincoln recalls many years later how he had to tread through the snow um, to do his chores or to get back and forth to people's houses. So he does talk about that, about having to go through the winters. Shortly after Nancy Hanks passed away, Thomas Lincoln took off and left four of the kids that were there at the Lincoln homestead: Abe, Sarah Lincoln, his older sister, Sophie Hanks, which was his cousin, and then Dennis Hanks. They all stayed together, and they were left alone for several months until Thomas came back, married with to Sarah Bush Johnson. So she'd been married before. She had three kids, three children of her own, and they brought them to the Lincoln house, to the Lincoln homestead. So as mentioned before, Sarah Bush Johnson, now Sarah Lincoln, had three children that became the stepchildren of Thomas Lincoln. They were Matilda, Elizabeth, and John Johnson. Matilda would marry later on. John Johnson would have a couple trips with Abe down the Mississippi River, and I'll go through that later. But they had three stepchildren there. So in essence, you had uh, Thomas Lincoln, you had Abe Lincoln, Sarah Lincoln, his sister, older sister by 2 years, Dennis Hanks, Sophie Hanks, his cousins, and then you had Sarah Lincoln, and then you had Matilda, Elizabeth Johnson, and John Johnson, all on the Lincoln homestead. Now, Sarah Bush Lincoln became very close to Abe, and she did not have a really big education, just like Nancy Hanks. She did encourage Abe to read, and Abe was a very ferocious reader. He loved to read books, to his chagrin of his father, who did not notice, did not approve of such things. He thought they were unmanly, and so Abe did a lot of work on farms, clearing out farms, cleaning churches, and his father, Thomas Lincoln, would actually hire him out, and then Lincoln would come home and give him some of the earnings that he had. And so Lincoln did not get a whole lot of education. He was actually self-taught, taught himself a lot. He did have some education, but not a whole lot. Now, Dennis Hanks was also with Abe when his father was away, and Abe was quite proficient at taking care of himself. He'd go out with the rifle and bring home squirrels or whatnot to help feed the others. So they weren't completely helpless, but they were left alone. And Dennis Hanks was with them, and so was Sophie Hanks. So the four of the children were basically alone until Thomas Lincoln came back and getting married. He got married to Sarah Bush Lincoln in December 2nd of 1819, and they returned to the homestead. Now, Dennis Hanks would say later on in life, he would say, or write, mostly said, because he wasn't really that literate. He didn't write that well, so he would be known to say Aunt Sari, called Aunt Sally, which was Sarah Bush Lincoln, calling her Sally, basically. Aunt Sally, the new mother, had familiar faculty and didn't appear to be hurried or worried, none. That she got Tom to put in a floor and make some good beds and chairs. Basically, he was adding a loft into the cabin for Abe to sleep in and the others to sleep. So he did some work to improve the house. And at this time, like I said, Lincoln would be hired out to do work on other farms. Abe would actually write in his autobiography when they requested that from him. He wrote, "There were some schools, so-called, but no qualification was ever required of a teacher beyond reading, writing, and ciphering to the rule of three. If a straggler supposed to understand Latin happened to sojourn in the neighborhood, he was looked upon as a wizard. All of his schooling did not amount to more than 1 year. He also said there was absolutely nothing to excite ambition for education. Of course, when I came of age, I did not know much, Still, somehow I could read, write, and cipher to the rule of three. But that was all. Have not been to school since. The little advance I now have upon this store of education I have picked up from time to time the pressure of necessity. So he, according to his words, he didn't have a whole education, but he did. He he was an avid reader. When he was in New Salem, Illinois, there were passerby saying that he would be reading Blackstone's commentaries. So he did educate himself. So in the summer of 1827, Link had assembled a small little raft and along the Ohio River because they were in southern Indiana, so it was near the Ohio River. And and according to him, he voiced many years later, about two men who came down to the shore in carriages with trunks were looking at different boats and singled out mine. And one of them men said to Lincoln, "Will you take us and our troops out to the steamer?" Lincoln certainly, said I. I was glad to have the chance of earning something. I sculled them out to the steamboat, and they got on board, and I lifted up their heavy trunks and put them on deck. Each of them took from his pocket a silver $50, and I could scarcely believe my eyes. As I picked up the money, I could scarcely cradle that I, a poor boy, had earned $1 in less than a day. So that was one of the first jobs he had away from home. But in reality, he ended up sharing it with his father. Same summer, Sarah Lincoln, that is Abe's older sister, got married to a man by the name of Grigsby. So her name was Sarah Grigsby. So she was married to him, and actually, in the winter of that year, she passed away in childbirth. So, giving birth to a child, she passed away, and that devastated Abe too. So, Sarah Lincoln, Abe's sister, passed away on January 20th of 1828 during a labor. She died, and she had a stillborn baby too. This devastated Abe, and he rode a horse over to meet with the father, Aaron Grigsby, and his father. And so by this time, he had lost a younger brother in 1812. He had lost his mother. He had lost his aunt, Elizabeth, and he had also lost his sister by the time he was 21. He remained in Indiana with his father till approximately 21, when he was 21, and his father decided to move to Illinois. Abe had a cousin by the name of John Hanks. He was the brother of Dennis Hanks, older brother. Dennis Hanks actually was about 10 years older than Abe, and John Hanks was a little bit older too. John Hanks was her cousin, and he was in Illinois, and he had come back to Indiana and was speaking very highly to Thomas Lincoln about Illinois and the rich farmland in Illinois. Thomas Lincoln decided to up and move to Illinois, and he moved to Macon County, Illinois, which is a little bit south of Decatur, and was there for a while. But then he decided to move a little bit farther south of Decatur to Coles County, which is outside of Charleston, and this is where he had his last homestead. By this time, Abe had already gone out on his own. So when he and the family moved to Illinois, Abe was pretty much on his own. At 21 years old, he was on his own, and he had a few more ventures coming up. I will go over later. And also, Dennis Hanks, kind of out of the picture, eventually ended up marrying Elizabeth Johnson, Abe's stepsister. So they would slowly grow out of the picture also. But this is where we're going to end right now. Thank you for watching, and do subscribe. And we'll go into the next chapter on Abe's years after 21. Thank you very much.